Good morning. Thank you, everyone, for joining us on what we are told will finally be a spring day. Our plan is to meet until it warms up outside and then let you go. I'm Mike Green. I'm Senior Vice President for Asia here at CSIS and a professor at Georgetown. We have a report to explain to you today and look forward to your questions and our discussion. We usually open our events when we're in this large hall with a few security announcements. I am your designated safety officer. If we have a situation where we need to evacuate, you just go back down one floor and out the doors, and our rallying point is the National Geographic building around that way, just around the corner from M Street. Although this has never happened, my suspicion is people will just go home, so we won't know where you are. But the key thing is, we'll tell you what to do. We go around the corner, get away from the building if we need to. We at CSIS have done a lot of work, as you may know, on infrastructure in Asia, particularly under a program called Reconnecting Asia that my colleague Matthew Goodman leads, that looks at connectivity across the Eurasian continent, and also our Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative, which uses unclassified open source satellite imagery and analysis to try to make sense of what's happening in Maritime Asia, where we have spotted in recent years Chinese island building exercises and so forth. And work we've done under a Smith-Richardson Foundation grant, doing case studies of maritime coercion or incidents and trying to understand the lessons in terms of the tactics involved, but also the larger geopolitics of China's growing assertion of its territorial claims in strategic waters, and then the reactions of other states. So in that larger body of work, we decided to take a look at a new aspect of China's economic and geopolitical outreach in Asia, the so-called New Silk Road or Maritime Silk Road, which is associated with the Belt and Road, which grew after the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is new and significant in its own way because it, as an overall framing for Chinese investment and strategy, focuses on ports and facilities and infrastructure building in the Indian Ocean. And the Indian Ocean is strategically important to a lot of other states, not the least of which would be India, but also Australia, Japan, the United States. And so with some support from the Japanese government and our own research efforts on AMTI and Reconnecting Asia, we put together a team of our best researchers, economic, infrastructure, military, security, to do some case studies and look at this Maritime Silk Road to try to see what we can find in terms of the economic rationale behind it. There is, after all, a severe shortage of infrastructure funding in Asia. The World Bank, the Asia Development Bank, Japan are not sufficient to cover all the infrastructure needs. So there could be some economic rationale, but also to understand the geopolitical and military implications of some of these infrastructure projects. We looked at 4 infrastructure projects. Greg Poling, who is a fellow and runs our AMTI, looked at Kakpyu in Myanmar, an important infrastructure port. Greg is trapped on the Mark. Did you make it? Oh, you snuck up behind me. Greg had his own infrastructure experience, I understand, on the Mark train. I'm glad you made it. And then Hanban Tota, which is a port in Sri Lanka, and Jonathan Hillman, there you are, who does a lot of the work on Reconnecting Asia on infrastructure, looked at that case study. So Myanmar, Sri Lanka, and then we had another author who's not here because he's in Delhi right now, but we had Gurmeet Kanwal, who's an adjunct fellow with the Wadhwani chair here, look at the Gwadar port in Pakistan, And these were the 4 case studies. Not everyone is here. Then we had a look at the economic implications, putting the template of economic development, smart, rational, economically viable infrastructure development, putting that template on it. Do these ports make sense? And Matthew Faniole from the China Power Report to my right, and Jonathan Hillman from Reconnecting Asia created a really useful and interesting template to look at these infrastructure projects in strategically sensitive areas to try to determine how much of it is explainable in terms of economic requirements, infrastructure requirements, economic viability. Mixed answer, as you'll hear. Zach Cooper, senior fellow in Asia Security here, did a paper for us on the military implications. So just looking at it in terms of warfighting, phase 0 shaping, gray zone maneuvering implications, but also crisis or even warfighting implications of these facilities. We couldn't get everyone up on the stage, so we got a team that's going to look at some of the case studies, some of the templates. Andrew Shearer took a look at this from the perspective of the Quad, the US, Japan, Australia, India. We need a noun to go with those 4 proper nouns. Coordination forum that was proposed by Prime Minister Abe 11 years ago and has now come into effect. The major maritime powers that care about the Indo-Pacific becoming and remaining an open maritime domain. And then we've asked Amy Seawright, who didn't do a paper, to come in and give us a fresh perspective and look at how ASEAN and Southeast Asian nations in particular, but also some of the other South Asian countries are viewing this. Are they viewing it as economic, strategic? Is there a strategy? Is there a common view within ASEAN? Probably not. But how does the entire Maritime Silk Road look to the recipients, broadly speaking, of the funds and the security implications? The overall conclusion is mixed. The Maritime Silk Road objectives are neither purely military nor purely commercial. And China's approach is evolving, which is why the Quad, the ASEAN piece, the U.S. policy piece matter, because we came out of this project realizing that the Chinese views are not monolithic and are evolving and are shapeable. If we think about how we respond to, in some cases perhaps cooperate, in other cases set down some markers for this new dimension of China's geopolitical infrastructure strategy in Asia. I want to also give particular thanks before we start to Sarah Watson, who started this project as a coordinator when she was with the Wadhwani chair here, and then Nick Sencheni from the Japan chair, who picked it up and got the project across the goal line. Rebecca Shirazi, who did a great job with our iLabs team on the visuals. You'll see when it's up on the web today that the graphics are quite compelling. And Rick Rosso, our Wadhwani chair in India Studies, for giving us some good guidance. So I think what I'll do is start with Matthew, who, together with John, provided a template for how to think about the economic implications. Then I'm going to go to the west, start on the west, and ask Jonathan to talk about the Hambantota case in Sri Lanka, and then we'll go to Myanmar with Greg, and then I'll ask Andrew to talk about the Quad and how the larger powers are viewing this and might shape it, and then Amy for how some of the smaller powers are viewing this and reacting to it. So Matthew, why don't you start us off and give us a template so we can look at these case studies with better accuracy.
All right, thank you, Mike, and thank you everyone for coming out to help us launch this report today. As Mike mentioned, what John and I set out to do with this part of the report was to outline some benchmarks that we could use to assess the economic viability of new port construction associated with the Maritime Silk Road. And I'm going to run through some of those. I have to go over them kind of quickly. There's more detail, obviously, in the report, and that should help set the stage for some of the case studies that we're going to go ahead and discuss. So in a sort of broad sense, what we did when we were looking at the Maritime Silk Road was to take a step back and think about maritime trade networks through the Indo-Pacific region. If you think about this, there's a steady state right now, right, before the Maritime Silk Road is even a factor. These states are already trading with one another. So we can look at that and get a sense of what is already economically viable and where are there areas and places where there could potentially be improvement. And from there, looking at things in that way, we can set out some criteria. And there's 3 criteria that we looked at, which I'll talk about. And those can really be used to understand any new port construction project in the region, right? It doesn't just have to be associated with the Maritime Silk Road. These criteria could be used for any sort of port construction project. And then we applied them on top of the cases that are part of the report itself. So the first factor, the most obvious factor really when we're looking at this is location, right? If you look at a map of the world and you're looking at trade networks in the world, you probably want to plop down the new port that you're going to build along a major trade route, right? That makes sense. You can tap into existing trade flows, and that's something that you can capitalize on if you are seeking economic motives with your new port construction. The important thing to keep in mind here, right, is that these are point-to-point logistics. So there are these established routes that are designed to reduce costs, right, reduce time from the origin to destination. So new ports, if they are seeking to be economically viable, should be situated in a lot of cases along these major trading routes. The problem with that is that these routes have existed for a very long time, long before the Maritime Silk Road was ever something that anyone was talking about. So in most cases, there are already ports along these different trade paths. So what this means is you have to start looking at new port construction in proximity to an existing or an established port and try to understand what a new port could potentially offer, right? Does the established port in the general vicinity, does it have capacity issues? Is it inefficient? Are there logistical headaches and potentially safety issues for traffic moving through that space? And if the answer to some of those questions is the affirmative, then you can say, okay, well, maybe this new port does make some sense. Maybe it is offering a new service or new types of traffic can move through this area. We focused looking at that factor at Sri Lanka, and John's going to talk about that in a little bit more detail. But the Port of Colombo, which is very close to Hambantota, obviously, is one of the busiest container shipping ports in the world, but is expanded its capacity to keep pace with traffic moving through the area. So the economic motivations for Hambantota aren't exactly clear. There might be other factors at play, and that's one of the things we discuss in detail in the report, and then John expands upon in his section. There's also the possibility that a new port isn't situated right along a major maritime trade route. And while that oftentimes raises suspicion, especially if you look at some of the literature that's already been written about the Maritime Silk Road, there could still be economic motives at play there. The idea being that, ships don't just go from point A to point B, right? They're stopping at all these different points along the way, especially on longer journeys. In a particular port on that path, a node in that network could suffer from the inefficiency issues that I mentioned just a second ago. Or it could be maybe not in the best position as far as a long sort of trade path is concerned. So a new port construction project further afield from a major trade line could in time serve to redirect some level of trade flows for a particular type of traffic. So again, a situation that has in some literature raised concern, there could still be economic factors at play. And that last factor, that really ties in with the sort of third component that we look at, which Mike mentioned, and which I know John will talk about in a little bit more detail, and that is how do these projects tie in with other infrastructure, right? It's fine to focus on the maritime space, and that's what we're doing with this report, but as far as I'm aware, most people don't live on the sea, right? They don't live on the ocean. The goods that are entering into those ports, they need to be offloaded, they need to be put on trucks, they need to be put on trains, they need to be carried ultimately to consumers. So any new port construction project, or really any port anywhere, needs to be tied in with the necessary land-based infrastructure to carry those goods to their real final destination. And that is something that we also evaluated as far as the economic criteria are concerned. The combination of a new port construction with the necessary land-based infrastructure to support that new port could, over time, serve a long-term economic goal of servicing and developing an underprivileged area. And a lot of these ports that we're going to talk about today, and a lot of the ports associated with the Maritime Silk Road, are being developed in places that are historically underdeveloped. So what might that look like? I'll give a sort of a quick example of that. If you think about goods traveling all the way from Europe to inland China, I mean, think about the journey that they're going to have to go. They're going down and around Africa, across to the Indian Ocean, through the Strait of Malacca, across the South China Sea, into Chinese ports, and then they're traveling another several hundred miles on rail or on roads to get to their final destination. So if you're looking to develop provinces in inland China, it might make sense to fund a new port project somewhere in South Asia, in Myanmar, for instance, which Greg will talk about, so that goods can enter the continent at an earlier point, and if the appropriate land-based infrastructure is there, it can carry those goods to their final destination, save several thousand miles off the journey, reducing costs and helping to serve the long-term development of the region. So those, in very quick, and I know I sort of rushed through them, but I don't want to bore everyone at 8:30 in the morning with methodology, are really the three sort of factors that we look at. We look at location, and that location has sort of two factors. How close is a new port to an existing trade route? How close is it to an established port? And if it is close to an established port, how does it compare as far as the services that it could offer? And then the last is, how does this new port construction project tie in with other infrastructure to carry goods once they are now on land, so for the overland path? And those three factors, I think, come up in all the case studies that we discussed to varying degrees. There is obviously a lot more nuance in there, and I hope that we can discuss that during the Q&A. And there are quite obviously other factors that are at play, but we had time constraints with what we were working on, so we really only focused in on those three.
Great. Let's look at the first case study, Hambantota in Sri Lanka.
Thank you. So I think what's really fascinating about the Hambantota case is, no one in Sri Lanka set out to build a port that they would then give control of to another country. And yet that's exactly what happened. And so I think we have to step back and ask, why did that happen? How did it happen? And this, of the cases we looked at, is probably the one that's the furthest along. So perhaps it provides some warning signs or some lessons that might be applied to other, both ongoing projects and projects that have yet to be announced. So I think one of the first takeaways is that this was something that was really driven by, at least on the Sri Lankan side, by a desire to develop. We're talking about a port on the southern edge of Sri Lanka in a district that has been historically very underdeveloped, an area that was hit by a tsunami. And this project was seen as a game changer for that region. And as Matthew mentioned, often many of the same things that make a project attractive as a game changer, quote unquote, for an underdeveloped area also pose challenges because those are areas that are not as well integrated with broader infrastructure networks. And so that's something that the Hambantota case definitely illustrates as well. I think another important lesson is that there was really a lack of alternatives as the Sri Lankan government was considering who they would partner with to make this project possible. I think they did approach other potential sources of funding, but at the end of the day, they were negotiating with, they were looking at one option or not doing this project at all. And I think that ended pushing them toward accepting project terms that were not necessarily as competitive as they might have been otherwise. So accepting higher interest rates and project conditions project terms that they might have not accepted were a more sort of competitive process, or if more outside funders were interested in pursuing the project. Another really important part here is that this project became a political imperative. It's really, it's very identified with not the current government in Sri Lanka, but the previous government. But it actually began even before that government. This is a project that in 2002 was identified as being part of Sri Lanka's development plan. And so it at least conceptually has existed for quite a while. But you need someone to really champion a project like that And so the champion was the last government, the head of the last government in Sri Lanka, whose political support, his base, came from the area in which this port was going to be built. And so you see evidence of those dynamics not only with this one port, but with a whole host of projects, many of them in that district, many of them Chinese financed and also bearing the name of the former president. And so I think this is another dimension that Matthew and I explored, and the economic look at this is that, often the most economically viable projects might not be building a new port. They might be expanding an existing port, but that doesn't often carry the same political payoff as building a new port and having, the ribbon cutting ceremony. It's just the incentives are not quite the same. One last point that I'll make is that I think although this project was initially floated as part of a development plan, it was never really integrated into becoming part of a development strategy. And so it was pursued almost, not quite in isolation, but almost without regard to other projects that were underway at the same time. And so that's important because at the time that Hambantota was becoming a reality, Sri Lanka was taking on loans and pursuing other projects. And as no single project, got their debt levels to 95% of government revenue. But after a while, after each project was too attractive to walk away from, those levels rose, and they found themselves in a difficult position, unable to pay back the loan that they had taken, and then re-entering negotiations, which ultimately resulted in them giving equity and a 99-year lease of that port. And so I think that this is, really a reminder that these individual projects have to be put into a larger development framework in which you're looking at overall debt levels, you're looking at other, related projects. Really, as Hambantota was going along, as the construction was happening, there were plans and activities underway to expand the capacity at the Port of Colombo. And so really, Hambantota's toughest competition came from within Sri Lanka economically. And so, a broader economic development strategy might have tried to reconcile and avoid some of those tensions. So I think those are important lessons. I think that they're not unique necessarily to Hambantota. And so I think they're certainly worth learning from and watching in future cases.
Thank you. Thanks, John. John gets the prize for the best title, which is Game of Loans, How China Bought Hambantota. And the 99-year lease giving control of the port to China is ironically and deliciously evocative of the British imperial strategies that led to control of Hong Kong. I wonder how many Chinese involved had that in the back of their mind as they created this quasi-colonial approach to Sri Lanka. We'll come back to some of these and unpack them a bit more. Let's go further east now to Greg, Myanmar, Kyaukphyu. It's interesting, these are Sri Lanka, the coast of Burma, Myanmar. These are all locations, as I think Andrew might explain, that are also evocative of what the Royal Navy and the Royal Australian Navy and the U.S. Navy dealt with in World War I and World War II, trying to prevent the Indian Ocean from becoming hostile territory. So the geography we're talking about has a more than 100-year history in terms of how navies have thought about access to and control of the Indian Ocean. Right, over to Myanmar.
Thanks, and apologies for running at the last second. I had a clever quip about me relying on the MARC train and DC infrastructure, but Mike stole it from me.
It's too obvious.
So jumping into Kyaukphyu, one of the things that we have to recognize about Kyaukphyu is it's one of these projects that certainly predates the BRI by a number of years. The idea of it predates it by quite a while. The original MOUs for what is going to develop into the industrial zone on an SEZ and the deep water port were inked in, I think, 2009. And they've had kind of been canceled and renegotiated over and over. But since then, they've been lumped into the larger umbrella of the BRI, as a lot of these Chinese projects have throughout Southeast Asia. It shares some of the same rationales as other projects, but it has its own unique drivers that I think it's important to recognize. So when we when we worry about potential military uses, when we worry about economic rationales, we have to remember that there are drivers in the case of Chalkview that don't necessarily apply elsewhere. One of those, as Matthew hinted at, is...
Sorry to interrupt. We didn't have a map up. Apologies for that. We're going to put a map up. This is not an evacuation situation.
Well,
sorry.
I assume everybody's intimately familiar with where Chalkview is in Myanmar. Sure. Well, so while that warms up, the two rationales that I think really drove the Chinese before there was a BRI to start looking at these projects in Chalkview were, one, the ongoing, perhaps inflated concern about the Malacca Dilemma, as the Chinese strategic thinkers often call it, the idea that an adversary, the U.S. or others, could close the Malacca Strait and thereby cut off vital Chinese energy imports as well as commercial imports in the case of a conflict. And so the first thing that went in at Chalkview was the terminal for offloading oil and gas, and then the Shui gas pipelines, which now run from Chalkview over the border and end in Kunming, where they're refined. The oil pipeline just opened last year. The gas pipeline opened a few years ago. Neither of them are going to prevent Chinese overdependence on the Malacca Strait, but they're not inconsiderable. These do, depends on the numbers you look at, maybe 10% at maximum capacity of China's national oil demand each year could be provided by these pipelines. So they certainly have a strategic value that is not reliant on the idea that the Chinese might use Chalkview for military purposes or anything else. The other economic rationale that I think makes perfect sense, and as Matthew alluded to, is the idea of shortening routes for commercial traffic to southwest China. So right now, if you want to ship goods to Kunming, really the way you do it is, if you're coming from Europe, you ship it through the Suez Canal, across the Indian Ocean, through the Malacca Strait, all the way up to ports on the Chinese east coast or the south coast, and then take it by rail or road hundreds of miles into the hinterland. And as you imagine, that is wildly expensive. It's certainly not efficient. If you build a large container port at Chalkview and you build a road and rail network over the border into Kunming, then all of a sudden you've taken what is thousands of miles and shaved it down to a few hundred, 500-600 miles. That has real potential for the development of China's southwest provinces. And it is a larger part of China's strategy in Southeast Asia to allow connectivity through other places, Thailand, Laos, Vietnam, to drive development of Yunnan in particular, but all of Western China. And so when we talk about Chalkview, let's not lose sight of the forest for the trees here. There are certainly concerns that are shared by other BRI projects, but these two overriding Chinese strategic goals predate the BRI, and in a sense, they make sense. I mean, certainly the Malacca Dilemma, we might argue, is overblown, but in the Chinese strategic mindset, this is a longstanding fear, and it makes sense that they would look to blunt the impact of any closure of the strait. Now, that said, there are real concerns, I think, on the side of outside powers and certainly on the side of Myanmar about this project. The first that gets talked about most often is the idea that, like Djibouti or potentially Gwadar, or now we hear concerns about the Maldives, that the Chinese could seek to leverage Chalkview, the commercial port that they hope to build, into an eventual spot for Chinese military presence. I think in this case that is premature at best. I mean, Burmese are famously, they're not interested in foreign boots on their soil, let's say, and the Constitution that was written in 2008 and approved in 2010 specifically bans foreign troops from Burmese soil. So the idea that you're going to have a permanent or even a rotational Chinese military presence in Chalkview seems unlikely to me. Now, that doesn't mean that the Chinese can't make port calls and use it for logistics or resupply or any of these things, but that's not exactly the same thing, and it's certainly not a concern. I think it calls for immediate concern. The bigger concerns from our side, and I think the Burmese side, is, as with Hambantota, that Chalkview could turn into a debt trap. So the Chinese have already signed the MOU for dredging a deepwater port that the figures I've seen are $7.3 billion for the total price of the project. The Chinese have 70% of that, which was negotiated down from 80. The government of Myanmar has 15, and then a consortium of Myanmar companies have the other 15, backed by the Myanmar government. So you put all that together, and that's about $2 billion that the government of Myanmar is on the hook for. If they split the adjoining special economic zone 50-50, which they might do, that raises the total investment required by the government of Myanmar to about $3 billion, which, as Yoon Soon over the Stimson Center has pointed out, is about 5% of Myanmar's GDP. The only way you can imagine the Myanmar government paying for that is to take out Chinese loans, which is the way that a lot of BRI projects get funded. And as we've often seen, Chinese loans are not necessarily usurious, but they usually come with harsher interest rates and terms than, say, ADB or World Bank loans. And so down the line, this, in combination with other projects in Myanmar, could very well lead to an undue amount of economic leverage on the part of China over the government of Myanmar, especially as other partners, Europe, the US, not so much Japan yet, begin to pull back and reconsider sanctions amid the ongoing ethnic cleansing in Rakhine State and concerns about democratization. The other concern is whether or not there's actually going to be any economic benefit to Myanmar. Because ultimately, the port, as the planned commercial port, as we've seen with the oil and gas pipelines, are to feed China. It is to turn Chakpu into a way station for the transport of goods to the Chinese interior. It's not going to create a whole lot of Burmese jobs. It's not going to create a whole lot of benefit to the Myanmar economy. What helps Myanmar is the adjoining special economic zone, the idea that the Chinese are going to help manage this large industrial zone that'll, create local manufacturing, IT sectors, what have you, and really bring jobs to the country. The problem is that the Chakpu Special Economic Zone, if it actually gets off the ground, is going to be last in a three-way race because you already have an operating Special Economic Zone south of Yangon run by the Japanese at Kilauea, and you have the large Dawei project, which has been moving in fits and starts for years now, co-managed by the Thais and the Japanese. Both of those are much closer to the existing commercial center of the country in Yangon. So if you're a foreign company and you're looking at plopping a factory in Myanmar, and you're looking at 3 special economic zones with relatively the same incentives, why would you build one out in the middle of the hinterland in Rakhine State instead of building one a few miles outside of the capital? That's the concern that you start hearing in Myanmar now, that are we going to end up with basically a giant parking lot next to this port funded by China with no foreign companies other than a handful of Chinese SOEs willing to invest? And so I'll wrap there.
Excellent, thank you. So you can see already that in each of these case studies, there are plausible economic explanations. There are more direct geopolitical security explanations, but there are also, as John pointed out, diplomatic or political influence factors, the naming of the Hanmatota port after the previous president and so forth. So it's a complicated stew, and the implications are still not entirely clear. Potential implications are clear, but the actual implications are not entirely clear. And it's going to require some vigilance, but it's also going to require a pretty diverse toolkit and a coalition of countries that care about the economic development and security of this region. And the 4 that are most prepared in terms of national power, navies, and interests are the members of the Quad. So Andrew Scheer actually has been working on the Quad. He's seen it rise, die, rise again, come back from the dead. And so with that historical perspective and also the geopolitical side, let's turn to Andrew for what some of the major maritime powers ought to think and do about this.
Thanks, Mike, and good morning, everyone. The Quad, or the US, Japan, India, Australia group really dates back to 2004 when those countries responded within a matter of 24 or 36 hours to the Boxing Day tsunami in the region. And the key to why that group came together then, I think, lies in complementary geography among the 4 countries, capability, and in particular, advanced maritime power that those countries could bring to bear, but also a habit of working together, at least in the sort of US, Japan, Australia context, increasingly with India, but also values in the sense that those countries have a commitment to maintaining what is now coined the free and open Indo-Pacific, and a commitment to delivering public goods, if you like, in that region. But as Mike hinted, when you look at this map, I think what's really interesting is that these trade routes go back thousands of years. So what we're talking about here is not new. There's nothing new under the sun. And the fashionability of the Indian Ocean is one of these things that ebbs and flows, and it's back in fashion. But when you think about the Indian Ocean, it's really been the absolute fulcrum of global geopolitics, at least since Vasco da Gama. And as Mike said, during the Napoleonic Wars, there was a lot of competition and activity in this region. During the First World War, the supply lines through the Indian Ocean were crucial. Again, in the Second World War, for the supply of the British fighting in the Mediterranean, for the resupply of Russia, the Lend-Lease supplies, I think about 40% of them came through the Indian Ocean, and keeping China in the war through Burma. So this is an absolutely crucial region, but there's not much new. The revival of the Quad, of course, in November 2017, followed a hiatus from 2008 when Kevin Rudd pulled Australia out of the Quad. And that, along with the fact that and we talk about this in the report, the fact that the readouts from the 4 Quad countries are quite different of the same meeting, the history of the Quad and those different readouts and the sort of divergences and omissions might tend to feed any scepticism you have about the durability of the Quad as a longer-term institution, if you like. And I think there is some room for scepticism because the Quad has to really prove itself and get itself established. The 4 members of the Quad have somewhat different perspectives and interests, of course, and again, that's to do with their different geography, their different threat perceptions, and also different dynamics in each of their relationships with China. But if you look at the United States, for example, if you read the National Security Strategy, the National Defence Strategy, I think the Quad and the Quad as a vehicle for responding to the Maritime Silk Road Initiative clearly fits within that broader construct of US-China strategic competition. For Japan, it's different again. Japan, of course, is more of a frontline state when it comes to dealing with increasing maritime assertiveness by China, particularly in the East China Sea. But also Japan has a long-standing interest in the security of the sea lanes running through this region, of course, and a broader interest in the rules-based order and current challenges to that order. Australia is interesting, and hitherto Australia has obviously been the weak link of the Quad. Hopefully that's behind us. But Australia, I think, clearly has had a more ambivalent relationship with China and attitude to China than some of the other countries. Australia's got a lot more strategic depth, for example, than Japan, and the Australia-China economic relationship, at least, has been less complicated than, say, the US-China economic relationship. And for all of those reasons, Australia's perhaps trodden a bit more cautiously, but I think if you look at what's happening now with Australia, both in terms of reports of Chinese political interference in Australia, pushback by the Australian government, and a cooling in the diplomatic relationship, and then just last week reports that China might be looking to establish a military base in Vanuatu, about 2,000 miles from Australia. Lots of excitement, and I think a sense in the Australian national security community of convergence with perceptions in the other Quad countries. And then finally India, which was the most reluctant country to sort of get the quadrilateral band back on the road, feeling, I think, the risk of encirclement by the Maritime Silk Road dimension of the Belt and Road Initiative, but also the overland aspect of the initiative, and that concern, of course, is fed by China's support for Pakistan, and that very difficult relationship for India, and the growing presence of the PLA in the Indian Ocean. On any given day, there are 4 or 5 PLA naval vessels in the Indian Ocean. That's not a lot of ships in a very large body of water, but there are now something like almost 100 PLA naval vessels with the capability to range far into the Indian Ocean. And so if you look at the trend there and the potential if you like, for China if it wants to flood the zone. India is becoming more concerned about maintaining the balance of power and stability in that region. So looking at where the Quad goes, how it can contribute, I think there are some kind of guidelines that we should bear in mind. I think key to the success of the Quad will be to keep it informal and keep it focused very much on functional cooperation. The quadrilateral is not going to be an Asian NATO anytime soon, and it shouldn't pretend to be. I think it's important that the Quad focuses on a robust security agenda, and if you look at the issues that the first reconvened meeting focused on, they were things like the rules-based order in Asia, freedom of navigation and overflight, respect for international law, connectivity, which has been talked about a lot here, obviously, maritime security, non-proliferation and terrorism. So there's the basis there of a pretty robust security agenda. It needs to be backed up by increasing exercises. The Malabar exercise has been the sort of centre point there, but there will be more than that. And building interoperability among these four countries so that they can successfully shape the maritime environment in this region and, if necessary, deter potential adversaries. But a security agenda is not going to be enough in itself. There needs to be a robust economic pillar. There's scope for these countries to work together on infrastructure and connectivity, not necessarily in the way that China's doing it with massive concessional loans, but by bringing our approach to infrastructure, public sector, private sector partnerships, concessional finance, and our standards for doing these projects, openness, accountability, transparency, and so on, and coming up with an attractive counter proposition to some of the downsides that have been talked about today here from China's activity. Energy is another area. There are two major energy exporters in the Quad, and there are two massive consumers of energy. Those four countries have a huge interest in maintaining market-based energy models in the region. And there's the whole sort of online economy, intellectual property protection, data protection and so on, where they could work together. And then diplomatic coordination in the region and globally, coordinating their development assistance activities much better and their capacity building activities in the region, coming up with approaches to countering coercion. Each time a country gets put in the sort of doghouse economically, I'm very struck by the fact that they're basically left hanging out there to deal with it themselves. Seems to me that we should be thinking more about how we can support other countries that are put in that position. And then just two other sort of principles that I think should guide the Quad as it moves forward. One is just proceeding step by step, so not setting hugely ambitious goals and then being seen to spectacularly fail to achieve them. I think that's really important. And supporting India as the strategic lead in the Indian Ocean part of the Indo-Pacific, I think, is hugely important. There are lots of ways that the other three countries can do that, and this can be, if you like, an economy of force effort for the United States, Japan and Australia, with India maintaining a strong military lead, a strong diplomatic lead in the region. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Andrew. So, Amy, the in between the larger maritime democracies that Andrew's discussed, the members of the Quad, and China are all of these smaller littoral states that want the money but don't want neocolonialism, don't have, even within ASEAN, a common view. What's the zeitgeist, the worldview? Can they handle this? Are they organized internally or regionally to resist undue strategic influence, or are they just lying vulnerable to a more malicious intent?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. This was a really terrific report, so I'm happy to be associated with it without doing any work on it. The first point to make, of course, is that ASEAN wants infrastructure and needs infrastructure. The Asian Development Bank has done a couple of studies on this, and these numbers are often cited, that over the next 15 years, ASEAN's infrastructure needs for it to maintain its current levels of economic growth are in the range of $2.3 to $2.8 billion, which works out to about $200 million a year of infrastructure needs. And just for a comparative point, the AIIB is only capitalized up to $100 million. So clearly, the needs are large, and the existing, taking away China's Belt and Road Initiative and the Maritime Silk Road, the other existing sources are limited. So pretty much every country in the region welcomes China's infrastructure investment. Its overtures that it's made through the Maritime Silk Road. Of course, Xi Jinping traveled to Jakarta in October 2013 to launch the Maritime Silk Road, the first half of the Belt and Road Initiative. And, you know, Xi Jinping has put a lot of focus on President Jokowi of Indonesia. I think he really sees Indonesia as a critically important partner on the Maritime Silk Road. And Jokowi has been willing to play ball and has given a lot of support for the Maritime Silk Road. There's also been a lot of emphasis from Beijing on, in addition to Indonesia, on Malaysia and Myanmar, as Greg's report has made clear. And of course, on the mainland side, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, there's been a lot of focus from China on building up the transportation corridors, the rails and roads that connect these countries to each other and to China. So countries in the region welcome infrastructure. The rulers of these countries, whether they're less democratic rulers and one-party states or rulers that come from more democratic societies, they do have, you know, for them to retain their legitimacy, the countries in this region have very much tied the legitimacy of the ruling class to delivering economic growth. And so if you need infrastructure, and whether you need to win an election or just maintain a reasonable degree of popular support in your country, it's going to be very hard to turn down easy money. This is a point that John Hillman has made very well, I think, in a number of his writings. Now, of course, they have strategic concerns as well. These are fiercely independent, nationalistic countries that are jealous of their sovereignty, but they're going to examine these trade-offs through their own sort of domestic political lenses. But Mike, you asked me specifically, is ASEAN unified in its response? And the answer here is pretty much no. ASEAN has been trying to take a unified approach to infrastructure development. It calls it connectivity, and it includes not just hard infrastructure, but what we call soft infrastructure as well, the kinds of people-to-people ties and technology and other communications systems, other kinds of things that are also important for connectivity. ASEAN's been putting a tremendous amount of focus on connectivity. It developed an ASEAN master plan of connectivity in 2010 that looks out until 2025. It prioritizes particular projects, especially projects that link countries together, and there's been a real focus on trying to bridge maritime and mainland Asia through a variety of these connectivity projects. So ASEAN has been focused on connectivity and has tried to prioritize and come up with a relatively unified approach, and yet when Xi Jinping launched the One Belt, One Road initiative, ASEAN did not come up with any kind of statement or unified approach to what was then called OBOR, now called BRI. So there's some passing reference to synergy between OBOR and the ASEAN Master Plan of Connectivity in some of the communiques that have come out between China-ASEAN meetings and the big Belt and Road Summit that was held in Beijing. But they're really just passing references. There's been no attempt by ASEAN to take a unified, coherent approach to deal with China as a region. Instead, countries have been dealing bilaterally with China. President Jokowi has been talking to Xi Jinping about various projects, as has Prime Minister Najib, and all the way down the line. So China's taken a very bilateral approach, and these countries have been sort of comfortable with that. The final thing I'll say is that I think there is the way these countries view this is a little bit different among mainland countries and maritime countries. Because in the mainland Southeast Asian countries, there is a concern about overdependence on China because China has been so actively engaged in economic activity, especially in countries like Cambodia and Laos, and increasingly Thailand and Myanmar. And all of these countries, at some level, have concerns about becoming too dependent on China and what that would mean for their independence and their own national goals. And they're also very focused on the Mekong River and issues around the Mekong River, the need for transnational coordination on a number of issues related to the river and just having shared boundaries. And China has really stepped in at a time that, unfortunately, the United States and others have not found a way to really maintain a strong effort in trying to promote coordination and cooperation in the Mekong. The United States had launched the Lower Mekong Initiative. It never really lived up to its potential. China has stepped in a really big way through its Mekong initiative. And when I travel around those countries in the region, I hear a lot of concern about where that is headed. Then, of course, you have the maritime countries that have been very focused on China's behavior in the South China Sea. And many of them have disputes with China in the South China Sea. But even countries like Indonesia that don't technically say that they have a dispute, they're not technically claimant states. They have a lot of disagreements with China about China's behavior and a lot of concerns about China's assertiveness. So they look at China through a very different, a very sharp lens. They're deeply wary of China's strategic motivations and intentions. And so, I think all of these countries are really trying to have their cake and eat it too, of getting projects funded that are important to them, particularly the rulers, that are either seeking re-election or just seeking to maintain popular support, while being clear-eyed about China. And I think they are looking at cases like Sri Lanka and as something to avoid. And I think we are seeing some evidence that some of these countries are bargaining pretty hard with China to try to make sure that they don't fall into that kind of debt trap.
Thank you. So these case studies help to unpack some of these questions. There are others we didn't do. For example, Vanuatu, which Andrew mentioned, wasn't on our radar when we started this project. And now you have the Australian Prime Minister warning China that it would be a red line for Australia to have a military base there, which clearly means the Australian DFAT or intelligence services are seeing clear evidence of Chinese intentions to build a military base. Malcolm Turnbull wouldn't say something publicly otherwise. And elsewhere in the South Pacific, you have, not as part of the Maritime Silk Road nominally, but you have Chinese infrastructure projects coincidentally going into exactly the places where the Defense Department plans on building new facilities for the Marines and the Air Force as part of the so-called Guam laydown, an effort to distribute forces away from Okinawa. And, if you talk to the Pacific Command, exactly where the Air Force divert runway is going to go, or the Marine Corps' new landing facility, there's suddenly a Chinese company offering to build a 1,000-room casino on exactly that land. So there's a broader pattern. And then if you go to the west, to Djibouti, China has a base there for counter-piracy operations like the U.S., like Japan. There are reports, I think quite credible reports, that the Chinese military forces are violating their agreement with the government by engaging in live fire exercises, and other reports that Chinese firms are looking at buying the commercial port at Djibouti away from Dubai World Ports, which would give Beijing control of the larger infrastructure, energy, water, and so forth. So we've only just kind of picked a couple of the examples. It's a broader geographic story, as Andrew suggested, by bringing up Vanuatu, which really wasn't on our radar screen when we started, so who knows where the next case study might come up. I don't know if any of you have seen this new Chinese movie, Wolf Warrior, or Wolf Warrior 2. I saw it on the plane back from Beijing. It's a kind of very popular movie in China. It's kind of a Rambo-like movie. Have you seen it? Yeah, it's great. If you like action, shoot-'em-up movies on the airplane, it's great. And it's basically a Rambo-type movie where a Chinese infrastructure project is under assault in a civil war, and so this Rambo-like Chinese action figure comes in and rescues everybody. But the opening and closing scenes are the most striking. The opening scene is a U.S. Navy-led task force. I think there's an Australian frigate, maybe a Japanese destroyer, fleeing, and going into port is a Chinese PLA Navy task force, steaming, at 25 knots or whatever. And then the last scene is a message which says Chinese citizens around the world should know that wherever they are, the PLA is ready to rescue them should they be in danger. It's a pretty bold statement of popular support in China, or popular expectations in China, that the PLA will be able to come and rescue them anywhere. And of course, China has had to do non-combatant evacuation operations in Libya and elsewhere. So that's another dimension of this, which coincides with the incentives we've talked about. I wanted to ask, there was an interesting point that came out of Greg's paper in discussion, that there may be some economic logic to the I'm pronouncing it wrong, the Chaopiu port facility, if it's connected to energy and other lines going to China. And so, using Matthew's template, that would be economically viable. So the question is, would it be good? So I want to ask first Matthew and then Greg and maybe John for this first round, if these ports, which are isolated in many ways, are actually just the beginning of a whole new network of infrastructure, which might be more economically viable, is that a good thing, or is that going to create even more problems? And why don't we start with you, Matthew, and see what your reaction is?
I think that the sort of follow-up question to answer a question with a question is, good for whom, right? If you're talking about development of inland Chinese provinces, looking at the Myanmar case, you could say that it's good for that particular outcome. And there could be knock-on effects for that, right? As development, if it goes smoothly in an area, that can improve other conditions for the people in the area, can improve safety in the area. So there are benefits there. The concern that I would raise with really any of these projects, and if they are connected with infrastructure or not, is kind of a secondary component, is there are economic motives, and we lay out some of these economic motives, but it is not clear to me, at least, and other people might have other views on this, if those economic motives are going to, in 90% of the cases, just support China, right? Whether or not it's going to support broader connectivity between the other states that are going to be touched by the Maritime Silk Road. Amy mentioned this, and I think Andrew mentioned it as well. South and Southeast Asia is particularly not well connected to one another, right? There is not a lot of intra-regional trade between these economies. And in project that's economically motivated to build up ports in that region and elsewhere could serve to boost connectivity between those states. But as it stands, I think if you're looking at it critically, yes, there's economic drivers at play. Those economic drivers may be good for China. Those economic drivers may serve other political and strategic interests as well, right? If we build up a port and it has a deep channel, that's great for large tankers that need to come in. That's also great for large military vessels that might also need to service themselves at that port. So I'm surprised that no one actually used the phrase yet. It's probably good that they haven't yet, but oftentimes we talk about dual-use facilities and dual-use capacity at these port projects. And if you're a Chinese strategist and you're thinking, hey, we're going to invest heavily in this port, there are some economic benefits, it would be silly for you not to also think about what the potential strategic and military implications are for those port buildups as well. And I think once you start thinking about all those follow-ons and all those knock-ons, it becomes a little bit less clear what the benefits or what the good, as Mike put, could be for other countries in the region that aren't China.
So, Greg, you raised this issue. Is there a scenario where the development of infrastructure from Chaopiu Port up to China for energy in particular, is there a scenario where that benefits the Myanmar economy and the people of Myanmar? And is it the kind of thing that the rest of us could start flagging and saying this would be a checklist of what would make these investments not just good for China's military access and energy access, but make it good for Laos, Myanmar, Sri Lanka? And in the Myanmar case, what would that be? Is there a scenario where this is actually, could you think of things that would that would make this a much more credible and viable case for the people in Myanmar and the economy of Myanmar?
Yeah, so I think it's helpful to put these projects kind of on a spectrum. You know, on one end, maybe you have projects that seem to only benefit China, or in the case of Hambantota, don't seem to benefit anybody. And then on the other side, you have projects that actually are creating economic incentives in the countries that make perfect sense, and we shouldn't, in a knee-jerk fashion, react to all Chinese investment as if it's a stalking horse of some kind. In Myanmar, you know, when the Shui gas pipeline first opened, 2013. Maybe it's 2014. The vast majority of that gas is going to Kunming. The Chinese are the ones who are using the gas. But they did build a plant for natural gas in Chokpyu. Some of it's being used in Myanmar. You could imagine that kind of sharing helping as the SEZ builds up, which was kind of the idea. The biggest problems with the project, aside from the financing, which I think we should all be deeply concerned about, as we should be with all the BRI projects, is one, transparency issues. You know, who is benefiting? In the case of Myanmar, as in the case of a lot of Southeast Asia, these projects are being done between Chinese SOEs and, you know, military-run SOEs in Myanmar. It's unclear how much of the benefit's going to go to the overall economy. Two, with local communities. You know, the Shui gas pipelines run through deeply troubled regions on the border, through areas controlled by the Kachin, among others. There were deep concerns among local communities that they were being steamrolled and that the Shui gas pipelines could actually help become a trigger for future conflict. Land rights are a big issue, and one of the things that I couldn't cover in the paper because it opens up a whole different can of worms, but we should remember is that the entire Muslim community of Chokpyu was run out of town in 2012 during intercommunal violence, and so a large amount of the land being used for the SEZ, among others, might very well be land that was, you know, the result of folks being driven out by their neighbors in a military enforced campaign. And we've seen similar things over land rights in areas like the Moniwa copper mine in Lepidong, which led to a couple years long series of protests against the Chinese investor. The Midstone Dam issues of land rights was a big concern and helped lead to the cancellation. And so there are a whole bunch of issues of transparency, of equity, of land rights, of who actually benefits that we're not seeing grappled very well with, because the way the Chinese invest, especially in mainland Southeast Asia, is usually the Chinese government helps broker a deal between the Chinese SOE and either a major, you know, business conglomerate that's well connected or an SOE in the country. It's all done with, you know, behind closed doors. Often the terms are unclear even after the project's signed. And all the local villagers are kind of told, don't worry, this will work out for you. There's not very much recourse if it doesn't, but don't worry, trust us, it'll work out for you.
You know, you unearth another really interesting dimension to this, which is in Myanmar right now, of the 11 ethnic group conflicts, there are, I think, 10, perhaps 11 ceasefires. There are no resolutions. And part of the reason is the underlying question of control of natural resources and economic benefits. So what you're pointing to actually makes Myanmar's future less certain and creates potential for instability that would actually be against China's interests, in addition to everyone else's. John, how would you answer this question for the Sri Lanka case?
Sure. So I think you know, both what Greg has said and what Matthew has said gets to this broader point about if we're looking at the economic value of these projects, we definitely have to do more than just count cargo ships, right? And so I think, you know, there's a whole host of criteria you have to look at. You have to look at really from the very beginning who is getting an opportunity to participate in constructing these projects. We have a database of about 2,300 infrastructure projects with the Reconnecting Asia project. And something we did was we compared about 100 Chinese-funded projects versus 100 ADB and World Bank-funded projects. What we found is that in the bucket of the Chinese-funded projects, perhaps not surprisingly, 90% of the contractors were Chinese. In the World Bank and ADB projects, it was around 30%. So, you know, Chinese companies are still very competitive and, you know, more open processes. But that's a big disparity. And a lot of these projects, including the port at Hambantota, are promised as part of the sales pitch as development projects, is that they're going to benefit people who, you know, local workers, local companies. And I think there's there's evidence that those benefits are not always delivered. When I visited Hambantota in January, there was a group of about 70 former workers, now unemployed, standing outside the Port Authority office protesting. And certainly, the promises that had been made initially with the project were that not only would they be employed, but many others would too. And so I think that's one dimension of this. There's a whole bunch of other components. I think you have to look at both not only who's participating in the projects, but are these projects meeting environmental and social safeguards? So that's a question for the Myanmar case, for example. Are the right procurement practices being used? All of those, it's a very complicated set of issues, but I think all of those make up part of this question of economic value.
Let me, I'm going to flag two issues for Andrew and Amy and try to get a quick answer so we can get some questions and comments from the audience. The first one is going the other way, not the economic indicators, but the military indicators. What's the red line? So clearly a military base in Vanuatu was a red line. Is militarization or dual use of Gwadar port in Pakistan or Chakpiu a red line? What would it be? And is the Quad, for example, capable of deterring China from moving towards a more explicitly military exploitation of these bases? And then the other one is, and you can answer either or both. The interesting case with Hambantota is, the previous government was, in my view, in Sri Lanka, was suppressing civil society, was denying visas to NGOs. In other words, there was an ideological alignment between the previous Sri Lankan government and Beijing, and the very unfavorable terms of the loan for Hambantota, like the loan in Laos and other cases in BRI and MSR, was pushed through in a very non-transparent process. And so there's this potential, confluence of ideology and influence, and the countries that are not allowing full debate on these projects, that don't have well-functioning civil societies, accountability and free press, they're the ones that are getting these lousy deals. And in a way, I think it's not an exaggeration to say that Beijing is encouraging that political approach of suppressing civil society, not allowing open debate. So should we, the U.S., the Quad, be countering this to some extent or trying to shine light on it by supporting civil society? Is it possible that democratic politics will cause a backlash and we won't see more Hambantota or Laos deals? There's an ideological or ideational dimension to this too that's pretty important. So the military piece and the ideational piece, and you can answer either or both or none.
We've been sort of struggling with this project with, which bits of this are military and which are commercial. And I think what we should really do is take a step back. If you think about Mahan, he talks about maritime power, and this is about maritime strategy. We tend to fixate a bit on the naval component of that, but equally important in his writings is a country's commercial fleet, its merchant navy, and this sort of infrastructure. And if you think back about the history of American colonialisation, it was about coaling stations for merchant ships, but also, of course, the naval ships. You need to protect them. And I think what China's doing here is a maritime strategy. It's a maritime play. As they perfect their anti-access arrangements nearer to home, they've said this, they're going to put more weight on what they call far seas protection, and they're basically building an infrastructure to sustain an increased merchant presence around these trade routes, but also in time an increased naval presence to be part of presence operations and shaping the way that countries have done in this region for hundreds of years. So, I think that's what it's about, and I think it is important to be sort of very analytical about which parts of this are really problematic and which parts aren't. Myself, I don't really care if China wants to sink a whole lot of money into non-commercial ventures around here. And the other thing I'd say about the sort of maritime and overland parts of this. I'm not an economist, but my understanding is however many pipelines they build to get gas and oil to China overland, it won't cut it. They'll need the sea. They'll always need the sea. The volumes just don't work overland. So I think the maritime piece of this is going to be really important. And I think yes is the answer to the Quad and the values piece. I mean, I touched on it briefly, but I do think the Quad should find its way into an agenda around democracy promotion, the rule of law, supporting civil society in these countries and encouraging transparency. I think that absolutely should be part of the agenda. It's another example of why it shouldn't just be a military agenda.
I don't have too much to add. First of all, in terms of red lines and the way that ASEAN members see it, I mean, we've seen with the South China Sea, the Chinese militarization, the building up of these artificial islands and the militarization of them as military outposts did not prove to be a red line for ASEAN. So I wouldn't expect there to be clear red lines in terms of neighbors, perhaps Cambodia, offering access to Chinese military forces, and that may look like it's leading towards something looking like a Chinese military base. ASEAN, in its history, there's always been a movement, there's always been a number of members who have pushed hard, Indonesia being one of them, to have a collective agreement not to have any foreign military bases. And our allies, Thailand and the Philippines, have long pushed back on that. So because of that legacy, it's a little difficult for countries like the Philippines or Thailand to complain if Malaysia offers port visits or other things to Chinese military assets. But in terms of, Mike, your question about kind of transparency and values and what the U.S. role should be to promote transparency and shine a light on some of these. I mean, I think we have seen a number of cases where there has been domestic backlash, including in Myanmar. The Mia Stone Dam project is a case in point. We're seeing a lot of criticism in Malaysia of Prime Minister Najib and the projects that he's launched, joint development projects he's launched with China, and criticism of Jokowi in terms of the rail project from Jakarta to Bandung. I think these processes, even in countries with less robust civil societies, are important, and we've seen a number of cases of them. The Philippines, it's important to note, has received a lot of promises from China of infrastructure development, but nothing has been launched. So it's so there's been no cases of domestic concern or pushback, but we also haven't seen, there haven't been cases to really test yet. I think on the one hand, as Andrew mentioned, there is a role for the United States to play. I would say better to play it in conjunction with other allies and partners, as Andrew mentioned with the Quad, to put forward the best way of doing development and these infrastructure projects with responsible lending practices and high standards for social and environment and other things. I think that's a really valuable role to play. I would be careful, though, about taking an approach that seems to reject any Chinese-funded infrastructure through Belt and Road. I don't think the United States should go around the region lecturing these countries that all of the things they're doing with China are bad for them and are going to have negative outcomes, because that would be seen, I think, just as our debacle in the AIIB case showed, that it just looks like the United States is concerned about China doing anything in the region. And as I started my remarks with, the Chinese investment in infrastructure is a welcome development in the region. There are concerns that these countries have, and I think we can help them better understand what the concerns should be by having an approach that throws some transparency on this and puts out a better way of doing things, perhaps. But I do think we should not make it into a black and white issue that looks like the United States is just in opposition to anything that China's doing.
I think that's a very important caution about the AIIB and the Obama administration's pressure on allies not to join it. Bad move. I think everyone involved now retrospectively agrees was a bad move. I would put a sharp edge in answering my own question. I think we should be not only sustaining but expanding support for civil society. I'm on the board of the Asia Foundation, so I'm conflicted or biased, perhaps. But I would go further. I think that the U.S., Australia, other countries should have a rather deliberate information campaign to get information out through social media and other ways. Not to say Chinese infrastructure investment is all bad, to Amy's point, but just to encourage greater scrutiny. Then on the red line, red lines, what is a red line? I mean, if are you going to attack China if they build a military base in Pakistan? No, of course not. But I do think we need a sharper edge there as well. And with respect to Gwadar, Hambantota, Djibouti, I think the Quad countries and others, NATO, Canada, should have a well-coordinated position, and those countries should know that if there are Chinese military facilities built, then it will directly affect economic development and other things that countries like Pakistan need from us. And Beijing should understand it will lead to a very deliberate increase in what the Quad does militarily. I think we're at a point where to shape this in a more benign direction, we've got to be on our game. I don't know if the panel would agree or disagree, but I'm going to ask the audience to ask questions now and make comments, and we can react to that. So we have microphones, and welcome your questions. We do have microphones, right? Yeah, we'll go here first.
Thanks, Mike. John Mullen, McClarty Associates. Nice to see you all. Very interesting panel. For the Quad, how is the United States organized for that? Are there designated people in state and defense taking the lead on it? How is policy being developed?
So in the form that the Quad reconvened in, it was a foreign ministry-led meeting. So state has the lead, but separately there's a pattern of military and broader security cooperation where the Pentagon leads in terms of the exercise program for the year and so forth. So as usual, responsibility is kind of shared, and that reflects the fact that this has to be like a whole of government enterprise. I guess the challenge for the United States is to start fleshing out this free and open Indo-Pacific concept, which at the moment, frankly, is a bumper sticker. I think it's a good one. I think it's a really, a useful framework. But what we need to see from the administration is flesh on the bones. And frankly, my perception thus far is that, there may be some work going on in the bowels of different buildings around Washington, D.C., but people are a little distracted by other things at the moment, it seems. And this is where other members of the Quad, I think, can usefully step up. Japan's been doing this, feeding in ideas, shaping American thinking and policy. Even the name Free and Open Indo-Pacific is Japanese. But Australia could do more in that regard, I think, bring some ideas to the table. And hopefully India too, over time.
Right here, David.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Angelita. My question is with regards to the U.S. playbook and the China playbook, because from what it looks like, the context is that China pretty much wants the global monopoly game. I want a piece of this, piece of that, and everything. And then he has been beefing up his military for the past 40 years to reinforce that concept. But the underlying issue is that China seems to prey on vulnerable economies, and there's plenty of human rights issues in the economies in the countries that China goes for. And that also goes with my question for Ms. Seawright, because, Philippines itself has so many underlying issues of human rights and all that. And then with regards to the U.S. playbook, we've been playing global police for almost how many decades, which our focus have been on the global police, and then the casualties of the U.S. actions in terms of Afghanistan, Philippines, China have been preying on that too. And then the humanitarian relationships we have with countries, I don't think we have really been leveraging on that. Even altruistically. And then my question with regards to the Quad is that, there's also underlying issues, because China is like the guy that you don't want to offend because he has the money. And the U.S. has that tariff, put in the tariff issues with China. Japan is the third largest economy, and they have that biggest 350 or 450 billion trade with China. So you wouldn't want to offend China for that. Third, Australia also has already some underlying discrete negotiations with China in terms of treaties. And then fourth, India has been a victim of the China loans where they find it hard to repay. So now they have this experience of the silk trade economy as kind of like, in the end,
We're going to
sorry.
have, yeah,
Okay,
no, that's okay.
thank
We're
you.
going to go through the whole top 20 GDPs in the world. But your question is about the ability of these countries to actually do something, given their economic interdependence. And let me, David, why don't we get a question over here, then we'll do with the yellow tie, and then we'll let the panel have a last word before we wrap up.
Thanks. I'm Will Embry from DynCorp International. Amy mentioned a soft infrastructure. Maybe because I'm a former diplomat, I think China's really playing the long game, and their investments are really aimed at developing a web of social, cultural, economic, linguistic, familial, media ties, which in the long run is going to bring them into the region and push out the West. I wondered whether you agreed with that.
Okay. Let's do a lightning round. All right. 1 minute each.
I sort of have two comments on that, and one's going to sound a little bit academic, so hopefully it's not boring. But that is that we have to be cautious when we're analyzing anything that China's doing, in the same way that we'd be cautious in analyzing the same thing that any state's doing. So, is China expanding and looking to expand its influence across the Indo-Pacific? Like, yes, okay, that's fine. But it's really how they're doing that matters, and that's what we really need to be analyzing. There's nothing that's inherently unsettling about any state with the geopolitical gravity of China looking to secure its overseas interests, right? If those are energy interests, those could be infrastructure interests. There's any number of ways you can look at that. And what we do in part of the report, and I think we also mentioned on the panel, it's how those policies and how those interests are really secured, right? If they are collaborative with other countries in the region, if they're supporting civil society in those areas, I think that the Quad would actually welcome them quite a bit. But if they are undermining, democratic movements, then that can be an issue in of itself. Just sort of one other mention as far as the soft power thing is concerned, it just raises a bigger question as to whether or not China establishing these cultural and linguistical ties necessarily means it's a zero-sum game in which Western soft power also can't be a factor in the region. I think it's a broader issue and it's a complicated issue, and I'm not sure there's necessarily a clear-cut answer to it.
So to your question, the fact that these, for the most part, recipient countries of these BRI projects need the infrastructure so bad is exactly what makes them so open to this kind of economic pressure, right? In the same way that payday loan lenders only work because people desperately need the money and have no other options. So the simple answer is obviously the Quad needs to provide alternatives. The hard part is only one of the 4 members of the Quad actually provide any alternatives. Japan is the only country that provides substantial infrastructure investment in any of these countries. India does some in the Indian Ocean, but when it comes to Southeast Asia, the Indians have been building a road to Mandalay since the 1990s, and it's not complete yet. They had the deal to dredge Sitwe, the port, which is also in Rakhine State near Chokpu, and nothing's happening. And so the one thing we can do quite easily, I think, is get a lot better at talking about what Japan, and to a lesser degree the rest of us, are already doing. And in the Philippine case, the narrative under the Duterte government has become China is this economic vortex that we simply can't escape. And yet, last year, Chinese total investment, FDI, into the Philippines was less than $30 million. Japanese investment was $600 million. U.S. investment was $160. China is the number 11 provider of ODA in the Philippines, something like this. And so certainly countries need this money. But the idea that there are no alternatives is not entirely accurate. And then to the second question, which I had something for and I'm already forgetting. I'm sorry.
Their soft power, our soft power.
Yes. So the only thing I would say is I always kind of cringe at the idea that the Chinese have some infinite vision into the future and are playing a long game that the rest of us can't comprehend. I think that in China's case, just like in every nation's case, China is certainly trying to plan for the future. We are all all countries are trying to lay the groundwork for our strategic future. But China makes mistakes just like everybody else. And 20 years ago we were talking about the charm offensive, and it was in tatters by the end of the aughts, by 2009. We had the good neighbor policy in 2013, which was in tatters within 6 months. And so yes, China right now is certainly ascendant when it comes to its soft power in the region, but just as often as not, China comes into these countries sharp-elbowed like a bull in the china shop, and ruins that soft power. And so I don't think it is a foregone conclusion that the Chinese are somehow going to, assert their cultural will throughout Southeast Asia, and there's nothing anybody can do about it.
The question about economic dependence on China, I mean, yes, just about every country in the region has China as its number one or number two trading partner, right? And that includes the members of the Quad. I mean, the interesting thing, though, is that despite all of that sort of gravitational pull at the economic level, the government's made the decision to reconvene the Quad. And what does that tell you? I think it tells you that even though, as I said very briefly, those countries have different threat perceptions and a range of different interests, there's enough underlying kind of structural concern about China's increasing assertiveness and the threat, frankly, that is posed to the liberal order by some of what China's doing to bring those countries together in this way. So I would see the reconvening of the Quad as a signal of the sort of underlying current of events. And on the question of Chinese soft power, just picking up on what Greg said, China makes mistakes, and I think looking at Australia right now is a really good example of this. You've got a situation where they've got incredibly strong economic links. China's the equal largest source of migrants to Australia, very successful diaspora, lots of people-to-people links, and yet they can't help kind of overreaching, and the United Front organisation comes in and starts mucking around with Australian politics, and that's generated a huge backlash. The most significant thing that's happened in Australia-China relations for a long time are the media revelations of very deliberate political interference in Australian politics, and that's generating a real concern in Australia that wasn't there previously. So I just want to back up what Greg said.
I don't disagree with anything my colleagues have said. I think it's a very interesting question you pose. I mean, China has hard power and soft power and sharp power, which is increasingly being looked at. China's use of manipulative, kind of non-transparent means to affect domestic debates and shape outcomes. China has sticky power, which is a term coined by Walter Russell Mead, in the way that it kind of lures countries into relationships, economic, people-to-people ties, other things that then that seem very attractive and appealing and up front, but end up having very adhesive qualities to the transactions. So China's got a lot of power. Now, yes, China makes mistakes, but China also has been learning about some of the mistakes it's been making. So I wouldn't be too complacent about it. And I think what it really should do is have us up our own game. The United States and other members of the Quad, yeah, we've got tremendous power in many of those categories too, especially soft power. And to your point, I mean, I would just reiterate, about human rights and civil society, I would just reiterate what Mike said, that there's still a lot of appeal that the United States and other members of the Quad have in terms of models of development and democracy, and we should be doubling down on our voicing support for those values and ideals and doing work where feasible to try to promote stronger civil societies and democratic institutions. But the difference, I think, is that China has unbelievable focus right now and is putting real resources into it. And it does have a long game, even if it's not a perfectly worked out, coherent strategy, it does have a long game. And the United States right now is distracted, it lacks focus, we're scoring a lot of own goals, we're very inwardly focused and not particularly willing to put resources into initiatives. Some countries in the Quad, like Japan, are stepping up. Some countries in the Quad, like Japan and Australia, are working with other like-minded countries to do things like launch TPP without us. India is stepping up in its own way to some degree. But the United States is not, and that causes me great concern. So I would look at all of China's varieties of power and agree that China has vulnerabilities and will make mistakes. but I wouldn't be complacent. I would use that to up our own game.
So I think it's a great point to try to think through, what are the shorter term implications of this versus some of the longer ones. And I think at least on the infrastructure end, there's a lot going on that could have some longer term risks. And so I think these projects are incredibly complicated. Even in the best business environments, they're usually late, they're usually over cost, they usually don't deliver as many benefits as they're promised. And China's operating in some pretty difficult places. And so I think it is possible, and in fact, we should expect that some of these projects will not work out. As to how many, though, I can't say. But there's certainly, I think, some risk that China has taken on that could come back later on. The political payoff, though, is already apparent. I think that's clear. There are representatives from 110 countries and international organizations that went to the Belt and Road Forum last year. And I think and about 70 or so countries that have signed up to the Belt and Road. Now, signing up is one thing, and actually, getting benefits from it is another thing. But I think that it speaks to the fact that this is an initiative that has political appeal in large part because it's a positive economic vision. And it's getting people to sign on to it because development is often the number one priority for many of these countries. So I think the best U.S. response, though, isn't to oppose the Belt and Road at every turn, but to put forward our own positive economic vision. And so if that's the Indo-Pacific, free and open Indo-Pacific, that's great. The Belt and Road goes other places too, but I think that's probably the most important area. And I think the Belt and Road, it's more than infrastructure, right? It does include trade agreements. The U.S. approach, the U.S. response, its own vision, I think should be broader as well.
So I think there should be no doubt that China has a strategy, a long-term strategy. Xi Jinping explains it, and it clearly has zero-sum dimensions for the U.S. and Australia and Japan. It clearly has military dimensions, but it also has economic benefits for some of the countries in the region, as we've heard. But if you think about it, 3 years ago, we were debating the AIIB. Then there was OBOR. Then there was Belt and Road. Now there's New Silk Road. Then it's Maritime Silk Road. Beijing is making this up to a large extent as they go along. And I think we have been a little bit complacent and sometimes stupid. But the fact is, we and the countries who are learning from what happened to Sri Lanka and Laos about these debt traps are going to learn, and then the Chinese are going to learn. It's going to be an unfolding process. And with this modest report, we wanted to shed more light on it. We're doing that with our AMTI, Reconnecting Asia work. Other think tanks and scholars are doing this work. And I think there's room for a lot more. And hope this helped, and appreciate your participation and your contribution. Please join me in thanking the panel and thanking all of you for joining.